After the very successful curtain raiser event that focused on productivity, technology, and innovation, we will today focus on the challenges in the employment statistics, informal economy and concerns, and labor reforms and employment. You can tweet your comments and questions using our Twitter handle #FECO2019. The first track of the day will emphasize on the challenges in the employment statistics. Our knowledge partner for this track is Indian Council for Research, International Economic Relations, ICRIER. The track will be chaired by Dr. Radhika Kapoor. I extend my greetings to Dr. Kapoor, Dr. Ajit Ghosh, Mr. Mahesh Vyas, and Dr. Amit Basole. Without further ado, I now hand over the dais to Dr. Kapoor. Ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Symbiosis, for organizing this conference, and Jyoti for putting this entire event together. We're actually delighted that we're starting the day's discussions with a session on employment data. Because employment data employment statistics are a key input in designing macroeconomic policy for policy responses to be meaningful. You need employment data not just to be in real time, but you also need it to be reliable, comprehensive, and accurate. And the state of our employment statistics today is rather unfortunate and unprecedented. And it would not be unfair to say that we are facing not just an employment crisis, but also an employment data crisis. And you're going to hear a lot about that over the course of the next 2 hours. But just to lay a context to this discussion, I'd like to take you back to a committee that was set up in May 2017 by the government. This was a task force which was set up to basically review India's employment data architecture and make recommendations to improve it. And one of the key motivations behind setting up this committee was really to try and generate more high-frequency employment data, given that most of the surveys that we have were generating the data with a considerable lag. Now, one of the key recommendations of this task force was actually to do away with the NSS's quinquennial employment-unemployment household surveys, which have traditionally provided us with labor force indicators both at the national and state level for decades. And what the committee recommended was to do away with these household surveys done by the NSS and more recently also being done by the Labour Bureau, and replace it with what was called the Periodic Labour Force Survey. Now, the Periodic Labour Force Survey is supposed to provide us data, employment estimates at the annual and rural, at the All India and rural level annually, and quarterly estimates for urban areas. And we do know that the results of the first Periodic Labour Force Survey 2017-18 are, the survey is complete. The results are in fact apparently finalized. The government, of course, has withheld these results. This is what we understand from various newspaper reports. And this, of course, raises a larger question about undermining the autonomy and the independence of our various statistical organizations. So household surveys definitely are the most important and reliable surveys to study the labor market in a country like India, where we have a dualistic labor market, where we have a very large unorganized sector which coexists with the organized sector. But at this point, we don't have any officially released household surveys, barring the last one we have is NSS 2011-12. In the interim, though, we have CMIE, and we have Mr. Mahesh Vyas from CMIE, who has also been doing a household survey, which has a sample size larger than that of the NSS, and his surveys, which have been happening now since 2016 on employment and unemployment, they already gave us a sense of the decline in labor force participation rates and the increase in unemployment rates, which are also reflected in the recently leaked findings of the Periodic Labor Force Survey. So we're looking forward to what you have to say on that. In addition to this, the task force actually had another recommendation which was quite critical, and this pertains to the use of data from administrative sources, data that's payroll data, administrative data which is coming from social security schemes. And we have seen that over the course of the last year, the government has been releasing, every month they have been bringing out this payroll data, which tells us how many people were added on to the payroll. Most of this data is centered around the EPFO database. And again, this data, the release of this data has spawned a lot of debate amongst economists, because essentially while this data does tell us something about enrollment on the EPFO database, the question of whether an enrollment on the EPFO database does in fact amount to creation of a new formal job is not clear. And there are several people who interpret this payroll data as saying that amounts to creation of new formal jobs. But that is something which there's considerable amount of uncertainty about. And so, most of us have been very apprehensive about using this payroll data to say something about employment trends. Of course, there is also the question of the fact that the EPFO data really pertains to the formal sector. And so therefore, if we want a holistic picture of the employment scenario, we need greater focus on the informal sector. And that's where actually the task force did not say much. We need to have a greater sense of what's happening to the informal sector, and also, how do we define informality? Because most of the discussion that we see on informality is defined as a residual. So how do we try to get a better understanding of the informal sector from, statistics going forward? The other related issue is also that of job quality. I mean, we've all heard multiple times that India doesn't face just a jobs problem, but it's a problem of well-paying, productive jobs. So how do we actually leverage our employment statistics to get a better idea of what is happening to job quality? Now, there are a couple of other issues which were actually not mentioned in the task force, but we've discussed over the course of the last year, and I'm hoping that the panel will also talk about these issues. One is that, as we move towards getting more high-frequency data, because like with the PLFS, we know we're going to be getting these annual estimates and quarterly estimates at rural and urban level as well, what should be the appropriate measure to look at employment? Most of our policy debate is anchored on the usual status measure. But given that there is an inherent smoothness in these measures, if we are going to get more high-frequency estimates, should we move towards looking at the current weekly status or the current daily status? In fact, the ILO also says that, the choice of the measure would depend on the local conditions of the economy. So, I would love to hear from the panel on that aspect of the debate. Also, a big issue for those of us who look at, labor force indicators in India, something very striking is the low and declining female labor force participation rate. Now, there is a very large literature which tries to explain this, but a part of the problem here also is a measurement issue. Where with the NSS surveys, we had the code 93, where women who might be engaged in economic activity were still counted as non-workers. So how do we better capture economic participation by women? Especially since women tend to be engaged in discontinuous employment, they're multitasking across, activities in the market and non-market activities, paid and unpaid employment. So how can our employment statistics better capture economic activity undertaken by women? The task force did allude to the use of a time use survey to capture this better, but we haven't seen much going on this front since then. The other reason why this also becomes pertinent is because, we are seeing the proliferation of non-standard forms of employment, the emergence of the gig economy, people undertaking multiple tasks at the same time. So how can our employment statistics also capture these issues better? The NSS tells you the subsidiary status, you can capture a couple of activities there, but if people are actually doing 4 or 5 activities at the same time and engaged in different tasks, how do our employment statistics capture that? That's another issue I hope that the panel would look at as well. And finally, something interesting that came out of the periodic labor force survey was also how we can use technology to actually reduce the time gap between collecting the data, processing it, and disseminating it, and how the use of technology can provide us with more reliable and accurate employment estimates. The Periodic Labor Force Survey used the CAPI methodology, the computer-assisted personal interviewing, and CMIE provides its surveyors also with a GPS-enabled device where they're able to verify the data at the end of the day, so they're able to provide it also in real time. So how can we actually leverage technology to generate more reliable employment estimates? So with that, I think I'm going to stop, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the panelists help us understand the dynamics, the very rapidly changing dynamics of India's employment data architecture, and also sort of try and understand how some of the more deep-rooted structural issues can be addressed going forward. So the structure that's going to be, we're going to first have the panelists give their respective presentations, and this will be followed up by a conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor to discussion. So may I now request Professor Ajit Ghosh to make his presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to everyone. Well, Radhika has already set out very well the sort of issues that we have to deal with. There's a lot of talk going by right now that we have, like she put it, that do we have a jobs problem or a jobs data problem? And now what I'm going to do is, before coming to the statistics, I think we need to ask the question as to what do we need them for? What exactly are we trying to understand or get knowledge of? And in that context, then talk about whether our data systems are inadequate or where the improvements could come, and so on. Now, so obviously the obvious answer to the why do we need statistics is that we want to understand the employment conditions and how they are evolving over time, how they are changing over time. This is what we want to understand. And then, of course, there are specific questions always as to, like we were asking, that what technology is doing to employment, to again analyze, to be able to analyze that sort of issues. So, but basic situation that we have, the economy in which the Indian economy being what it is, it's difficult to have, like in most countries, employment rate, unemployment rate, a few simple indicators like that give us a decent idea of what the conditions are or what's happening. Now, real problem is in the context of an economy like India's, you cannot get very much from that kind of indicators. And the reason is that employment here, our employment problem essentially, this is what we can all observe, is that there are a lot of people, basically nobody can be unemployed without being rich. Right? So yeah, and therefore they would work and they would be employed. The question is not whether they're employed, the question is more that what are they doing, what kind of employment they are in. And that is the problem. A lot of people are in very low productivity employment and their earnings are very low, and we call it employment by the usual criteria, but it is extremely low productivity jobs. Then the other problem is that there are many types of employment, like self-employment and casual labor employment, in which there is a lot of work sharing that happens, in the sense that 5 people doing the work that could have been done by one person on full-time employment. So there is a lot of work sharing means that there is a lot of underemployment. in those areas. So the problem really is how in this case, if we have an employment rate, that doesn't tell me anything of this kind. It doesn't tell me, suppose the employment rate is going up or going down. I cannot deduce anything about whether employment conditions have become better or worse. And I do not even know at the moment what the conditions are like. So that's one side of the picture. The other side, unemployment. To be unemployed, again, one must have a support system. To remain unemployed, you need to be supported by the family for a certain period of waiting. Now, again, that means this is why all the unemployment here is of educated youth, so fresh entrants into labor force who are educated and who can remain unemployed, who are looking for certain types of jobs, and who can remain unemployed for a while because the family has the ability to support. Now, so that's, I'm not sure, I'm not watching very well whether it's keeping up, but this is not important in this end. So the unemployment rate, therefore, unemployment essentially reflects unemployment of educated youth. So it tells us something, unemployment rate, but it doesn't tell us the nature of the employment problem in the economy as a whole, in the aggregate. It doesn't, like it says, it tells us, say, in the context of French economy or German economy, it doesn't tell the same story here. So now, given all this, you see, I'm saying this because the National Sample Survey was originally designed to capture these kind of complexities, so that National Sample Surveys actually produce very rich data, which have not been properly used, in fact. I'll come to some specific things, but the problem we had, of course, is that it was only done every 5 years. So the frequency wasn't there, so we didn't have enough. Now, there, of course, there are certain trade-offs one has to keep in mind before we do it. What is that? There is those sample surveys were large and with long questionnaires, so they produced a lot of information. In fact, as I said, even the people out of labor force, there's a lot of information on them as well, what they're doing in the National Sample Survey. But precisely because of that, they needed a lot of resources. So you had problems of both human resources and financial resources. So if you had to have more frequent surveys, you could not have that richness. And if you wanted that richness, you could not have it more frequently. So that was the problem. And I suppose the other side of the thing is that our changes were not also that rapid. You could not expect, say, participation rate changing every year in a drastic way. This is now things are changing faster. So in that context, we need indeed much more frequent data. But this. I don't know where, I can't really read it, but...
Can we give you the laptop there, sir?
That's okay, all right. I can talk without, I think if you can see it, that's all right. Okay, so what now, I think the nature of employment and unemployment, these things have not still changed. They are still the same. We cannot get enough information by looking at employment and unemployment rates. And therefore, although that is not to say they are not useful, they still tell us something. But if we have only that, we will not know about what's happening in the employment situation. So in that context, the PLFS that was brought in, I'm sorry if I'm not following that presentation. Okay. So using the employment rates and unemployment rates, we have to be, they can be very useful, but we have to be careful about interpreting them. Particularly the rising unemployment rate tells us that a growing percentage, because unemployment is mostly educated youth unemployment, so it is telling us about the mismatch there at that section. It is not telling us about mismatch in the whole economy. And then declining employment rate. Now that actually is telling us much more about the employment problem. Right? If the employment rate declines, it means there are a lot of discouraged workers actually. And this is evident when it comes to the women's participation rate falling, women's employment rate falling. So the other comment I wanted to make here is that it's commonplace nowadays to hear that because we don't have high frequency data, we have problems in policy making. Policy making is sort of constrained by non-availability of. Now, I want to make a comment on this because there's a misunderstanding somewhere. High frequency data is desirable, but nobody has said exactly how policy making will be done. Suppose I observe that unemployment rate has increased in the last quarter, or employment rate has fallen. Exactly what would be the policy response? Nobody has specified. Actually, there's an unstated assumption behind it, which is that unemployment is more sort of Keynesian. Then you do demand management, effective demand management. Other than that, problem here is much more structural, the problem in our country. And a structural problem cannot be handled like that. You can have short-term palliatives, special employment schemes or something of that kind, but the problem has to be solved through the growth process and therefore growth strategy. And that's not a short-term thing. This is a sort of. So that particular claim, I sort of dispute because it's in fact a misunderstanding. It's not as if, like Federal Reserve does, that you see something and you tinker with the interest rate and then things will change. Our economy is simply not like that. Okay, I will now make. Okay. Now, you know all this. I just put them down. These are what we have. The kind of, as Radhika has pointed out, household survey is the best source, and these are the household surveys we have, and these are the establishment or enterprise surveys that we have. Now, and these are the administrative data sets. So this is the sort of database we currently have now. PLFS has just been launched, periodic labor force survey. So NSS old style surveys has been abandoned. The new style PLFS is annual. It's going to produce annual data for the national level and then quarterly data for urban centers. So now, what is missing here? We have an annual survey of industries, but we don't have a comparable survey of services. So we ought to ideally have an annual survey of services. Then there is the question of unorganized sector. We do have a survey, NSS survey of unorganized industries and services, but that's periodic. It's again not annual. Ideally, that could be. If that could be annual, that would be good. And we need a periodic time use survey. Now, as you can see, we need all this. These are ideally what we should have. But there are trade-offs, and so there are resources required. I mean, not putting adequate resources and carrying all this out would simply produce bad quality data, and which would be not worth using. So we need to, for example, when the PLFS was being designed, the problem arose that old questionnaire of NSS could not be sustained, because if you're doing it more frequently, you need a shorter questionnaire. Now, what do you leave out? What kind of information you sort of leave out, and what kind of information you generate. So these things have to be sorted out. In fact, resource allocation is not adequate. They get too few resources for producing too much. They are statistical organizations. They are lacking in human resources. They are lacking in. So these things need to be now. Okay, I leave that, and I would just like 2 minutes to comment on a few things that Radhika had raised. One is usual status, current weekly status. Now, the reason, of course, current weekly status, as you know, the question asked is that, did you work for at least 1 hour last week? And if you did, you are in employment. Now, this is actually the thing that is pursued in most labor force surveys, even in developed countries. Now, in a developed economy, you would expect if a person worked for 1 hour, then would have worked for probably the whole week and longer. Because most people are in regular jobs, they have been in the past. In India, on the other hand, that's not true. If you had worked 1 hour, you might have worked just 1 hour, in fact, in that week. There's no guarantee you worked longer than that. So that's why usual status also becomes important. So it seems to me that, in fact, we need to have both, because usual status gives that longer view. In the case of female labor force participation, now we know that there are problems in sort of judging, distinguishing between what is sort of housework and what is productive work, or productive as within quotes, right? As economically gainful as it is the usual term used. But this problem has been there, but again, I think sometimes people make an error in the sense that if we observe declining female participation rate, that ought not to be affected by that difficulty. That difficulty comes in whether the female participation rate is actually that low. This is okay, but declining participation rate is not explained by that, because that error would be there in all the surveys. Same thing comes again when one thinks of cultural factors. Patriarchy and so on may be relevant, but again, it's not more relevant today than it was in 2000 or 1993. So again, the time trend is not really affected by these things. Now, why female labor force participation rate is so low is a question that we have all tried to understand, and I don't want to go into this now. Since I just end with one comment on this. This is on technology and employment. So I'll just make a comment on that side of the thing. The gig economy was mentioned. This is the new kind of, so in a way, even in the surveys, we have to have that to at least to have some estimates of what kind of this type of jobs, how much of the quantitative significance of these types of jobs. So survey questionnaires need to be changed a little. Although gig economy is something that's, in the context of the Western world, it's something quite novel, because they were totally on the regular employment scheme, and this has become, it's neither self-employment nor sort of wage employment, that kind of a job which didn't exist in the past in the West. Now, to an extent, we of course always had, casual employment, self-employment. So it is not all that distinct from that, but nonetheless, it needs to be taken. Finally, technology and employment. Yesterday was a very good discussion. I just wanted to make a comment and with a comment. In this discussion, of course, in the case of data, the question will be, whether we can study the effect of technology on employment from the database we have. That I believe we can, if we go by the kind of suggestions that we have made. But the real difficulty comes elsewhere. I mean, we are talking on the supply side basically. The technology coming in, and in a factory jobs are getting reduced, or in a workplace jobs are getting. This is the fact. Now the problem is on the demand side. How do we know that? Because it's obvious that if productivity rises, and if the same demand remains the same, employment will decline. There's hardly any doubt about that. The question is whether when productivity rises alongside demand will be rising or not, and this is the question that one ought to address. And that's of course not strictly data question. That's a more macroeconomic kind of question as to how the macro economy will be generating the demand. But I mention this only because I don't see it discussed very much. It's almost taken for granted that all types of jobs will come up, and so we'll ultimately not have a jobs problem, but type of jobs problems. But it's not that clear unless the demand side is understood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ghosh. I'm glad that we started this conversation by asking the question that what is in fact the pertinence of having such high frequency data? How does it in fact feed into policy making? Because we see a lot of fetish with producing these high frequency statistics, but before we actually expend large amounts of resources doing it, we need to have a greater clarity on how it's going to feed into our policy making, and actually does it help us in understanding the nature of the employment challenge? Are we actually compromising in understanding those issues simply so that we can get more high frequency data? And following up on that, I think it's only appropriate that we now turn to Mr. Mahesh Vyas, who provides us with very high frequency estimates. We read his column every week, and he's telling us what happened in the last week, last month. So we'd love to hear from you now.
Thank you for inviting me over here to Symbiosis. It's a lovely place and excellent crowd over here. And Professor Ghosh has set the game for me. Wonderfully timed. Yes, his criticism of fast frequency data is well taken. and I produce fast frequency employment data. So this can be an interesting session if the audience wishes it that way, if the chair wishes it that way. But I didn't know what Professor Ghosh was going to say, and I'm delighted to hear what he has said. My presentation is independent of what he has said, which is I will glorify fast frequency data. So here we go. And I was just telling him yesterday, I admire his report. It's a fantastic report produced by him, 2016 employment report. It's really wonderful. And I hope to emulate many of the ideas in that report. So let's see what I have here to say. So this is about challenges in employment statistics. And the first two slides of mine could have been made only if the presentation was made in the last 1 week or so, because this reflects the challenges which are relatively new. Three broad challenges that I see, these are observations, that we lack sufficient official data. This is something that we had all seen, that official data comes too late, and comes so late often that it's more or less of no use, excepting academics. But we have seen this getting worse. There's delay in conducting household surveys. We said once in 5 years, it's getting worse. There's delay in releasing the results, and there is delay in establishing credible enterprise surveys. So I think there was a need, and there is still a need, of establishing good enterprise surveys. We began partly in 2009 to make a beginning somewhere, which should have been strengthened, but I think that got shut down. I hope that is just to make something better. But right now what I see is no enterprise surveys, no release of official data, and very infrequent household surveys. Then we get confounding signals from the official agencies where available enterprise surveys are shut down. EPFO registrations is called jobs data, and some back of the envelope calculations are called jobs creation data. So I think this is getting bad, and I think the highly polarized debate which is around here today is actually very counterproductive. Instead of building institutions and building credibility of those independent institutions to build good databases and deploy them, the debate seems to be fragmenting people into believing that what we have done for all these years, all those household surveys, etc., were more or less of no great use. So I think there is an important need for us to rebuild the credibility of independent statistical agencies. And no matter what CMI does, no matter how much fast frequency data CMI produces or how credible it be, there can never be a case for not having official government data. So official government data, the NSSO, has to be strengthened, has to be given more resources. We require them to do more work. Every country in the world has an NSSO kind of organization. We need one, independent of what CMI does. So CMI has done many more things. We have a prowess database, for example, on companies, which is like an alternate to the ASI data, but that doesn't mean we should not do the ASI data. The annual survey of industries is as important as any other survey of industrial organizations, and that doesn't stop CMI from producing equally useful information in prowess. So I think there's a need to build those institutions, and this debate is causing pressure on us as well, but we continue to survive. So what is our response to the situation? CMI's response is, we create an alternate database. So we saw that the annual survey of industries used to take something like 4 years to get released. So we made prowess, which takes 1 year to get completed for a year, equivalent. So we reduced the gap, and today there are more than 300, maybe around 400 good research papers in peer-reviewed journals based on the prowess database. ASI also has, but here is one more database that gives you a lot of information on companies in India today. So we built a large household survey. So the NSSO survey sample could be 120,000 or so, 110,000 or so. We have 172,000. I'll tell you more about this. It's highly technology driven. It is validated in real time. So the moment the data is collected and uploaded, the data gets validated right then. So this is not a post hoc cleaning of the data that happens. The data is released in real time. So fast frequency, every day we release a number of unemployment. Professor Ghosh may find no use for it, but many people do find use for it. There is still application for it. The release of data is automatic. When we are all sleeping, 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, the computers release the data. Nobody's checking whether this is okay or not. This is not about sanitation. The survey is done through kosher processes. The numbers are generated through well-tested programs. Then there's no intervention required. That's the way we work. We do multiple frequencies. We are independent. Estimations are all available publicly, freely, and the methods are transparent, and the raw data is paid for by subscribers. Now, what is this survey that CMI has done? That's what this whole thing is about. My presentation is more about what do we do and what are the options we have given the challenges that I just mentioned earlier, that there is a certain kind of collapse of the official statistical machinery. At least in some places, we have a response. So this is the latest from the CMI stable, Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. It's now reasonably old. It's about 4 or 5 years old. It's a panel survey of 172,000 households. So it's a panel. We repeatedly go to the same households. The panel increases at a small rate. So it was 140,000 households some time back. It's now 172,000 households. So at the rate of 1.5 or 2% per annum, we keep on increasing the size of the households from new areas. That's a fairly large number of households per day. Nearly 1,500 households are sampled every day, and these are organized such that we get a fair representation of rural and urban every day. So that sample distribution over the 16 weeks of execution is designed to ensure that every day I can make a broad statement of employment, unemployment in the country. On a weekly basis, it's a pretty good sample of 10,500 households. Monthly, I have 43,000 households. It's good enough to give you an estimation at the state level. We do 3 waves every year: Jan to April, May to August, September to December. This is continuous. So this survey never ever stops. The survey is done every day, on Independence Day, on Republic Day, on Diwali, on Christmas, you name it. The survey never ever stops. So therefore, this enables us to do real-time experiments. We can see what happened before and after a real-time event. So that's a big advantage of doing fast frequency numbers. I've made presentations elsewhere which have demonstrated the impact of demonetization on unemployment. CPHS captures well-being of households. I capture a lot of information: demographics, income, expenses, ownership of assets, and I add customized data as well if there are people who want to understand something very specifically of their interest. So this is customized for them. Sometimes it becomes public. And I do fast frequency measures, of course. Now I'll come to focusing only on employment and unemployment. What do we do? So we began by asking exactly one question and no more than that. Mind you, a lot of the other information is anyway asked by us. So I know the people at home, I know their age, gender, occupation, education, and a lot of things were known in the CMI survey generally. So I knew a lot about them. All I had to do was to add one question. And I did this in 2016. Jan 2016, we added this question after doing pilots. That, what is your employment status today? So I come to a household and I ask the household, as of today, tell me the employment status of all people in the household who are of 15 years of age or more. And I get exactly 4 statuses that you classify each person into. Either the person is employed, which is very, very simple. The person is employed today. Or he is or she is unemployed, willing to work, and is actively looking for a job. This is important. And the next status is willing to work but not actively looking for a job. And the last one is the person who's clearly out of the labor force, who says that I'm not even willing to work and therefore not even looking for a job. So this is a fairly simple question that was very easily added to the questionnaire. And this question gave us the status of the person on the day of the survey. So if he landed up at the household of a person who's, let us say, a wage laborer, an agricultural laborer, or somebody who's getting employment only on a day-to-day basis, and the person cannot tell us whether today he will or will not get a job, we ask them, okay, did you have a job yesterday? So if not today, just yesterday. It's a very categorical statement. If I'm employed in a company, I know I'm going to work even if it is a Sunday today. I have a job with me. If I am a painter employed as a contractor with a contractor who says you to paint this place for the next 2-3 months or so, then even if I'm on not working day to day and not paid, I still have a job on hand. So the status of people who are employed is very, very clear. There is no ambiguity in that. There is no recall period in that. We're not asking you how many hours you have worked and not worked. It's just a plain simple thing. Tell me by your own self whether you are employed or not. Now, if you're not employed, then it becomes a little more involved. In the next two cases, whether you are willing to work and actively looking for a job. We call unemployed people as those who belong to category 2. And the third one are those who are willing to work but not actively looking for a job. So if a job comes my way, I will take it. We do not call them as unemployed in our current estimations, although we can do that. And if I had to match it to the NSSO, maybe I should add both these. But I went by somebody being called unemployed only if the person is actively looking for a job. If you're not actively looking for a job, then I say you're not exactly unemployed. You're still outside the labor force. So, but I give the option, because the raw data is available, you can always calculate it differently. Now from these 4 simple statuses of one indicator in the database, I can calculate the labor force. I can calculate the greater labor force, which takes category 3 as well. So 1, 2 and 3 together makes the greater labor force. And this number is released by us regularly. Greater unemployed, unemployment rate, and greater unemployment rate. So you have it all. I mean, I've got that distinction now between actively looking for a job and not actively looking for a job, although I'm willing to work. This is what I began in 2016, and I started producing outputs from it. Now, the first output we produced was a statistical profile. And the statistical profile gives a lot of information cut by various ways for the entire 172,000 households, which translates into about 550,000 adults, more than 15 years of age. So the sample size becomes quite large, and we can make fairly good statements at the wave level. Till now, we have done 9 waves. From Jan 16 till now, we have completed 9 waves, and the profiles of all these are available publicly. This is what one of the pages of the wave looks like. This, I hope, is partly readable. What this tells you is basic numbers on size of the population of people more than 15 years of age, the labor force in millions, labor force participation rate, employment rate, count of people who are unemployed, willing to work and actively looking for jobs, those who are willing but not actively looking for jobs, the greater labor force, unemployment rate, and the greater unemployment rate. All these indicators in the rows are the education status of people. So you get this at the end of every wave. So we've got 9 such observations which have been released by us in statistical profiles. So this is one simple view. The second view we have is by age. So you have many age bins over here, exactly the same indicators in the column. This kind of presentation, these 2 presentations by education and by age, is available by gender, by rural and urban, for 26 states and 2 urban territories. This is produced by us at the end of every wave, within 1 month of the completion of the wave, so it comes out very quickly. And this is publicly freely available. So this is one piece of work that we do. So if you are missing the NSSO, you can use this in the meanwhile. And this has fairly detailed information to make a lot of progress on our understanding of what is happening. This is what we do, which is faster frequency. This is trying to challenge what is possible. So this is a website. It is freely accessible. It's called unemploymentinIndia.cmi.com. On the far right corner, you will see the number 7.4%. 7.4% was the unemployment rate yesterday based on a 30-day moving average set of observations. So this is about 40,000 observations, 40,000 household observations, which can translate into 100,000 adult members' observations. Based on that, all India, I say the unemployment rate on a 30-day moving average window was 7.4%. Today morning I checked, it's 7.3%. So this is like a BP going, or Sensex going up and down every day, little up, little down, little up, little down. How useful it is, well, it's up to you. But we see that the unemployment rate in urban India was 8.1% and rural was 7%. The line chart you see on the side is a long time series of urban, rural and overall. This gets updated 3 o'clock in the morning every day. The bar chart on the left hand side is your monthly unemployment rate. And here I can say there is use for the monthly unemployment rate. Look at the variations. This does not remain stable. There are changes that happen that are significant and we need to take cognizance of this. But I think what is more important, and I will make changes to the side, I've learned is what is important in India is not as much the unemployment rate as it is the labor force participation rate. So I'd like to add a fast frequency labor force participation rate on a monthly basis, exactly like the one you have of the unemployment rate. So this is fast frequency data, available really very fast. I do not know of another country which is as large as India, which has a daily unemployment rate, but I do have one. I do put all this to use. I write a weekly column, use all this data to write all kinds of things in the Business Standard. This is a view to say that any one of you can download this information. All the estimates are available. If you actually log in, you can set up for getting an update into your mailbox every day. So you don't even have to come and visit our site. You just say you want this, and it will boom come into your mailbox 3 o'clock in the morning. So that's on the data that I've collected. Now, okay, there's one more piece of information. We added some more information of all the indicators I mentioned earlier in the columns by age group, education, but also occupation group and religion and caste groups. So we added this. It seems to add a little more flavor to those who use the Economic Outlook service. This is how it looks on the Economic Outlook. The raw data is all available to educational institutions for an annual subscription fee. Unfortunately, most of the subscribers currently are overseas. And they're doing good work, good research. One paper has got published. This is a new data set. But there are a few who have started using this in India as well. I hope more will come in. And I think the data should be used a lot more intensively. Now here I'd like to draw your attention to what I'm trying to do. So we added, as I said, exactly one question, employment status, and have exploited it, really milked it all the way for 3 years intensely. But now I thought that we should add a few more questions to get a little more flavor of what's actually going on in the labor markets. So we are asking people now, we just started this, what is your employment arrangement? Are you a salaried member? Do you have a permanent job, or is it a temporary job? Is it casual employment? Is it self-employment? So basically the nature of employment, salaried, casual, self-employed, temporary, permanent, those kind of characteristics are now added. And maybe in a few months' time, we will have outputs based on this to understand how many of them are casual, how many of them are more permanent types, and what changes are happening in this. The gig economy will have an impact, and I think some of those things will get reflected over here. We have also started asking questions on which industry do you work in. So we didn't have this. This is a very costly question to ask because there's a long list of industries. How do you make the person asking the questions which industry? The fellow speaks in the local language. You've got to translate that into a structure, and that's a little time consuming. We are also considering adding skills, the occupations list, which is even longer, but that's for later. We also have started asking the place of employment. Are you employed in government or in a company? Where a company you classify further? Are you working in an office? People prefer working in office as against working in a factory. People do not like to work in a factory, even if they are good engineers. So are you working in a warehouse, a retail outlet, or any others? So there are a few more classifications. I've taken the bigger ones over here to give you a flavor of what we're trying. Government is easy. Company, broken up into type of establishment you're working within. NGO, a lot of people seem to be engaged in working in NGOs. NGOs includes even temples and mosques, where a lot of employment is happening right now, actually. Is it your own establishment? Is it a shop or a vehicle? You could be driving your own vehicle, so this is also your own employment. Are you working in a marketplace, working from home? These are the broad indicators. Since when are you employed? How many hours do you spend working in your workplace as against home work? How many hours do you spend in doing dishes or cooking or laundry? And how much time do you spend working in the office or wherever else you work? Is your employment full-time or part-time? We're also asking questions now on why are you unemployed? So are there reasons why you choose to remain out of the labor force? So is it there's a family problem, there are responsibilities there, education, marriage, so on and so forth. The list is expanding. We're trying to get a little closer to understand why is India's labor force participation rate so low, and if you are out of the labor force, how long do you think you will take to come into the labor force? Do you think you'll come back in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years? So it's trying to get a flavor of the unemployed. So the earlier slide was about getting an understanding of the employed people, and this is about getting a flavor of the unemployed people. And all my questions are ask a simple question, get a simple answer. I don't do much more than that. Now, last 5 minutes, ma'am? Okay. So I think we should focus on current daily status and not on the usual status. The Indian economy is changing dramatically. And if we have more and more gig economy, it's even more important for us to look at the current daily status. We see that people's employments, now you can do the current daily status only if you do fast frequency. If you're going to do a survey once in a year, you have to take this usual status because people do come in and go in and out of employment. But I think it's best for us to understand what the status is today. Only then will you know the impact of shocks, and we do face shocks. We did see our labor force participation rate fall from, in our opinion, 48% down to 43%, even 42% because of demonetization. So if you want to see the impact of policy or of shocks, we require to have fast frequency and we require to have current daily status. The two go hand in hand. So this is my first suggestion. The second is, I think unemployment rate calculations and employment rate calculations should go into our macroeconomic understanding. The Reserve Bank of India and the Ministry of Finance at a broader macroeconomic level need to factor in unemployment being lower, not low, because that's what should determine what the monetary policy of the country should be. And it's not only a structural problem, there is a fast frequency dynamics to this as well. We need to focus on labor force participation rate. That's what I explained to you we are trying to do by asking more questions. There is a need for, even if it is a dirty and a quick enterprise survey, but let's not make the best as the enemy of the good. I think we're trying too hard to be a very good enterprise survey. I think we can do a quick and dirty enterprise survey and keep expanding it. I think it's important to do an enterprise survey. I think the administrative data, EPF, etc. is a distraction. I think we should best keep it aside. It's good for many reasons, but not for employment. And the task force need not be a guide for any further work. We need to think completely afresh. The introduction of administrative data in the task force report, I think, was a bit misplaced. I think it's important for us to bring in fast frequency data and still do the old quinquennial surveys that NSSO used to do. That depth was really very valuable. I don't think we have a good reason to lose that depth. It is possible to do a fast frequency survey like the CMI does. The PLFS, in my opinion, is not a good compromise. So that's another point I want to make. Good data is available in CPHS, which is Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, or CMI. Let's start putting it to use. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vyas, for providing us that very comprehensive overview of the CMI data. And I think it was particularly nice to see the enhancements that you're thinking of introducing. And I guess the question will also be that now when you try to add those additional questions and yet retain the frequency of your estimates, I mean, what are the challenges that you're going to run into? And also when you do things like industrial, what industry people are working in, or what is the status of their employment, how will the categories that you create map with what is given by the NSS or the PLFS, so how do researchers kind of reconcile those? But I mean, I guess the key point is, as you yourself said, both in the beginning and the end, that while these private data sources are extremely important, but we cannot undermine the importance or compromise on officially released government data. So, and now we turn to our last speaker, Professor Amit Basole.
Thanks, Radhika. And thank you to Symbiosis for organizing this really timely conference, and for inviting me to it, and for all the excellent arrangements over the last couple of days. So it's really good for me to go last, because I have actually very few things to say. Most things have been said. So I've been trying to think of how to, how to add some value to what has already been discussed. And I do have a few slides, some of which will be repetition, so I will skip through them because that's already been brought up. For full disclosure, I am also a CMI data user, one of the ones in India. But of course, we also use a lot of other data. And I will plug my report also, which came out last year. It's called The State of Working India. When I say my report, obviously, many people have worked on it. It's come from the Center of Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. I encourage you to go and take a look at it. We have surveyed a lot of the employment statistics to present what we thought was at that time a fairly reasonable picture of what was going on. Of course, the big problem being it ends in 2015, which for a report published in 2018 is not a particularly good thing, but we were constrained by the lack of data. So if you can just skip ahead to the next, can I just do that? So this is one of the things that has already been done, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. Professor Ghosh gave a pretty good, comprehensive, actually bigger list than this of the current data sources that we have at both the household and establishment at an enterprise level. I'll mention a couple of things. One is that I am told that the annual survey of services sector is forthcoming. I don't know what that exactly means, whether it's in planning stages or actually being conducted. This would be the service sector analog to the annual survey of industries, which, as Professor Ghosh also mentioned, is very needed now, because one of the key sectors that has grown in terms of employment is the service sector, and particularly the organized retail and other kinds of segments like that come under this category, and we do need much better data on that at the enterprise level than we have so far. On the PLFS, which is over here, I should put it here, not over there. On the PLFS, it's already been discussed. It was also, of course, subject of a lot of controversy, not least because the official Niti Aayog position seems to be that it is not comparable to NSS, which really muddies the waters. Because looking at the documents that have been in the public domain on the survey for a long time, and we've put them up on our website too, just in case they happen to disappear at some point for some reason. We have archived them. And you can look at them and see for yourself whether you think they're comparable or not. We think that there is no reason to be greatly concerned about comparability. And that was brought up in the response by the members of the National Statistical Commission in the response to the Niti Aayog CEO's piece. So if those of you are interested in these issues, you can read both those articles in the Business Standard to get an understanding of the issues involved. The bottom line, I think, is that PLFS will be comparable. As to its quality and so forth, I don't know, and this could be something we can discuss later. Now, what I want to say a little bit about is what is this whole big data and survey data. I want to spend a few minutes on that, and I've titled this slide, of course, a little bit jokingly, but there are pros and cons, I think, to both of them. And we really haven't had an adequate debate on what each type of data is useful for, which we should have had before we rushed into a lot of these kinds of pieces based on it. So very quickly, of course there's a very large literature on big data now, I'm not going to go into that, but volume, variety and velocity, as they say, is one of the strong points of this data. It comes in large numbers, you get many observations, you get them very frequently, and you get them from very many different kinds of sources. And I've put big and admin in one category. Obviously they are not quite the same thing. So I should say that a lot of the big data discussion is not about administrative data only. It's about things like Google or Facebook and a lot of these kinds of data that is being generated, which is privately generated, often proprietary, but huge volume data. Right? So it shows actual behavior, often in real time, but, and this is a very big but in our case, reliability is an issue in admin data. Right? We do have to keep in mind that it is only as good as the administrative agencies that manage it. There are also big problems of self-selection. So for example, what you are looking at, what you're measuring is a sectoral picture based on whoever participates in that sector. It could be somebody contributing to Google in terms of GPS data, or it could be somebody who shows up in the Provident Fund database. Whatever it is, it's not a random selection of the population, it's a self-selected population. And therefore, the coverage is also incomplete. Many people brought this up repeatedly when claims were being made, which Mahesh has also alluded to, on job creation based on Mudra loans, job creation based on something else, maybe Awas Yojana disbursements. A lot of these things can give you some idea of the level of employment generation through multipliers, but they are all sectoral pictures, they are all incomplete, and they do not give you the net employment picture in the economy. This seems like a very simple point, but has perhaps not been understood because people don't wish to understand it. Then there are concerns over privacy as far as this data is concerned, and of course issues of accessibility and reproduction, meaning not everybody has access to all this data. The way household data often is publicly accessible to researchers for verification and so forth. So EPFO, for example, some high profile studies came out, but that data at the record level or the unit level is not available for us to verify these things. Now on the other hand, the survey data, what it has going for it is that there is, if it's properly done, it is random, there is minimal selection bias involved. We are on a surer footing as far as the net picture in the country goes compared to the sectorally specific kinds of surveys. Then you get a wide range of information for each household, as has already been discussed. People have thought for many years over how to construct these questionnaires to get at the complexity of economic lives that are not your regular 9 to 5, 5 days a week kind of lives. So we can do that with surveys. They tend to be publicly available and often relatively cheap, though not all surveys are cheap, but many are. Moreover, anybody can purchase them and use them. The frequency on the downside, so those are the upsides of surveys. On the downside, of course, frequency is often low, and no matter how fast you do it, it's not going to be like a administrative or big data, right? Because it actually involves you going and talking to people, so there are going to be lags and so forth there. So its plus side is also its minus side. And there are also issues of reliability in service data, in survey data. So oftentimes big data or admin data, if it's properly done, can actually show you what is going on, and relatively fast. Survey data is definitely not immune from enumerator bias and respondent bias. And this comes up very frequently when we start talking about things like women's work and so forth. So one of the issues that we can discuss in the time that we have left is how do we ask these questions that we can actually get a better picture of what is going on, right? So in your typical scenario, if there's one man, the enumerator, talking to another man, the respondent, about the women in the house and whether they work or not, what is going on there? how is that question being posed? How is it being understood? What is the local language word for work being used? How is the man understanding that word? Is there a conflation going on between going out of the house and employment, which would of course negate a lot of women's work right there. So there are all of these kinds of issues, the nitty-gritty issues of surveying that I know Mahesh Vyas has also thought a lot about, so we'll talk about that. But that can lie behind low levels. Not necessarily the trends, as Professor Ghosh rightly pointed out. The trends still need to be explained in terms of female labor force participation rate. But certainly for the levels, we can do a much better job of capturing this data. And there's feminist economists and many others have worked extensively with system of national accounts to kind of arrive at some conceptual apparatus for this. And we need to more effectively deploy that in surveys. Not that there isn't arbitrariness there too. So I don't know, people may be aware of the SNA, extended SNA, non-SNA system of classifications, where, what kind of work you do. Does it fall within the system of national accounts? Does it fall within the extended system, which includes subsistence production, which would be code 93 in NSS. But there again, there's an arbitrariness that subsistence production of goods is part of that. This is the ILO system. But subsistence production of services is not. Right? So you could be doing livestock and producing milk for home consumption, and that should be counted in this system. But taking care of children will not. Right? So it's there's some sort of arbitrariness in these definitions too. So it's not at all an easy job to capture this. And on top of that, when it is mixed with irregular employment and fluctuating statuses, it becomes that much more difficult. So I think my final slide was just, again, has largely been dealt with, so I'll be very quick. The only point I will mention, emphasize on this is the last one, because the other two have already been discussed, and that is that I think we really are doing very badly in terms of assessing skills in the population. There has been a lot of discourse on this, there's a lot of concern that we are not adequately skilling people, etc., but I don't think we actually know the status of skills. And if you look at the NSS surveys, here again, these surveys, which usually do a pretty good job in many instances, don't do a good job in skills. So if you have anybody who's tried to use the data on vocational training, technical training, would know what I'm talking about. The vast majority of respondents just say no. Right? So if you take the data at face value, no training I mean. So if you take the data at face value, some 80% or 90% of the Indian labor force has no training of any kind. And maybe I'm just biased, but I just think that conclusion is ridiculous. Right? So what's happening is that we are not actually capturing what people are learning, where they are learning. They are not going to colleges, okay. They are not taking diplomas, okay. They're not enrolling in any organized or formal system of training, but obviously they are being trained, and we are not doing a good job of capturing where they are. And if we don't do a good job of capturing where they are, then any kind of policy for skill augmentation, etc., is starting off on a very shaky foot. Can I take 2 minutes to finish? Yeah. So I want to make just one bigger point in conclusion. And this is about statistics, but it's really about the politics of statistics. And recently I've been thinking about this because I'm never used to what I do being in such huge public gaze, and I never thought a 300-page NSS report should be the subject of primetime TV. And that's happened. Right? So we need to think about what's going on here. And I'll just offer, these are completely speculative remarks on my part. What we are seeing is really a new development, obviously. The employment rate is not a political rate in India. Professor Ghosh referred to this earlier. The economic issue that was of political significance in India was poverty. I mean, that's what most of us have been used to thinking about. And by poverty, I also mean low wages, etc. That's the main economic issue of political significance, but no longer. The unemployment rate is now an economic issue of political significance in India. And it is so despite the fact that that number doesn't mean much for the majority of the workforce. These two are both equally true. Professor Ghosh mentioned this, that the unemployment rate only pertains to a minority of the workforce, or the labor force. We know that. And yet it is immensely significant. And why is this happened? The reasons are very, very clear. There is a demographic dividend, which is the youth bulge, on top of which there is the huge push towards education. Enrollment ratios have gone up. The percentage of educated people in the workforce has increased dramatically in the last 20 years. It used to be 6% in 2004, it is 16% in 2015. That's a big change. So you have these two things. On top of that, you have most of the educated people in the workforce have either general purpose degrees, by which I mean non-professional degrees, which are the majority of degrees, or they have not good professional degrees, right, whose qualities are suspect, and there's a lot of data on this too. So we have a lot of poorly trained, possibly poorly trained graduates, that's the one. And then at the same time there's a big withdrawal of public sector employment. The major employer of general purpose graduates in the economy, the government of India, has not been hiring. So at the same time that there is a huge increase in the supply of general purpose graduates to the labor force, there's a big fall in the demand. Both because the public sector is not hiring and because employment elasticity in the private sector anyway is falling for reasons of automation and AI, well understood and will be discussed elsewhere in this conference. So all of these factors coming together on the supply and the demand side, interacting, and this is my last point, with well-entrenched structural issues like caste discrimination and patriarchy, give you a very kind of a perfect storm kind of situation. And why am I bringing in caste here? Two things. One, it creates immense incentives for lower castes to quit traditional occupations and move to get educated and get white-collar jobs for very good reasons, because that is the route to dignity and respect in society. And two, it creates pressures to not move the other way. Upper castes will not move into occupations that require any amount of working with hands. Lower castes have immense pressure to move the other way. Right? So unless we address these kinds of structural issues also, the labor market will not, the labor market is just an outcome of all of these things going on, the choices people are making. Right? So right now we have a very real issue of people who are coming from what could have been very well paid, respected types of vocational trades kinds of jobs, who are not doing that work because we have not created the situations where that work is respected and well paid enough. Instead, we have created pressures to get degrees that don't get people jobs. So anyway, I will get into further more of this because this is on statistics, but then thinking about why statistics are so relevant is what led me here. So I'll stop here and we'll go into the discussion.
Thank you very much, Amit. I think the point you raised about the political significance of unemployment rates is a pertinent one. And you did say how poverty rates were more important before, but I think it's worth noting that we also have no data on that. The last consumer expenditure survey was in 2011-12 again, so the officially released headcount ratio estimates are only from then. So I guess that's an equally big cause of concern, one that we're not talking about so much, both poverty and inequality. So it's been a fascinating discussion. We've heard some very interesting views, and I'd like the panelists now to ask each other a few questions. But the key thing for me, the key takeaway in terms of the employment statistics side is really what should be the optimal frequency of employment estimates released by the government. I mean, CMIE releases its daily, weekly, monthly rates, and those are all, of course, very useful for us as well. But from the side of the government, if we want to have, the kind of surveys which give us a more detailed picture of the nature of the employment channel, what should be the ideal frequency? And Mr. Vyas, you said that the PLFS was not a good compromise. If I got that correctly, it would be nice if you could elaborate on that, because now going ahead, that is going to be the main household survey that we will have. We had very little conversation on the establishment or the enterprise surveys. I mean, understandably so also because it's the household surveys which give us a more comprehensive picture. But again, on the unorganized establishment surveys, we do have data. It comes in once in a few years. But I think also for the unorganized sector, there is a challenge in generating estimates annually. So we have to recognize that as well. And Professor Ghosh, we started this conversation about how unemployment rate as such as a metric is not so useful because the problem for India is not one of open unemployment, but of disguised and underemployment. Yet, when we see the new PLFS estimates, we are always used to seeing unemployment rates in the range of 2 or 3%. And now we are seeing them in the range of 6 to 7%. So how do you see? Does that tell you something about the nature of the problem, how it's evolved, or is that more to do with the comparability issues? Because there is so much discussion going on, and because neither the questionnaire nor the report are in the public domain. I mean, we are just having our conversations are in a bit of misty haze. So those are just some of the questions that I had, and perhaps the panelists could respond to these and address some questions to each other, and then we'll open up the floor.
Okay, maybe let me start by answering, saying something on the unemployment rate you just mentioned. One would expect as the education level goes up, because unemployment is mostly of educated people, so as the education level goes up, one would expect open unemployment rate to be going up. Now, I think to an extent the new higher unemployment rate reflects that. It should not be so surprising in that sense. I don't see any other. Now, of course, this we could analyze if the data were released. we could find out exactly how, but that's my expectation. I would like to ask Mahesh something, and also Ami. So first, Mahesh, I should start by saying that it was not my point that high frequency data are useless. What I was saying that they need very careful interpretation. They have their uses, but using them requires a lot of caution. So having said that, I just would like to make comments or questions, whichever way you see. One is you see the CMI data that data is a panel, as you said, explained. So in a panel data, of course, you can see unemployment, employment, etc. rates fluctuating, but you would not see, for example, a lot of differences in, I suppose, industrial distribution or employment status and so on. You would not expect, because the same set of people you are talking. There may be changes, but they would be infrequent. They would be not great. But and the unemployment rate that you get, on the other hand, is actually a sum total of chronic and temporary, meaning like casual unemployment, or if there are casual workers, if they are self-employed, they would be unemployed on some day, and that would also be captured by your unemployment rate. But what I would say is you cannot actually do this the same way in a household sample survey, which is not panel, but then they give in a way the better picture on those sides, even with employment, unemployment, because you are not dealing with the fixed set of people. Right? Now, in this context, you mentioned CDS, so current daily status. Now, what you are doing is not current daily status, it is, but it's every day. Right? Now, no, there's no way a household sample survey could do such a thing. There was a current daily status in the earlier national sample survey data, which was asking about each day of the last week. last reference week. And that's very useful, that was very useful. That has been abandoned in the PLFS. The PLFS actually has only usual status and current weekly status. These are the two. Daily status is not there. No. And the current daily status could not be done, basically. It's very difficult to do. I happen to be a member of the Standing Committee on Labour Force Statistics when this was being discussed and questionnaires were being reviewed and redone and so on. So we tried hard to retain as much information as possible. For example, you could estimate underemployment from the PLFS data. It's possible. There are questions to that effect. So quite a bit has been retained, but still it's a much shorter questionnaire, so it cannot produce the kind of rich data that earlier NSS surveys did. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that CDS was very difficult in the context of household sample survey, which is done frequently, more frequently, because it would have to be, because it is a sample. You know, in a panel, CDS is the only thing that can happen. So now, my view of PLFS is not exactly the same as Mahesh's. I think PLFS will be useful. I'm not very hot on the quarterly data, quite honestly, because I'm not sure that, but that remains to be seen. We shall see it. But the annual data that will be produced, that's certainly going to give us good base for. Okay, the one other thing I had with Amit, one comment again. You know, the skills, the thing is that when you, in our country, vocational training, very few people get. And when you try to ask that question, you will say whether there is some recognized degree or something like that. That's when you are skilled. But actually, a lot of people are skilled through apprenticeship, essentially. That's how skills are generated. So it's not that, but in a survey, capturing that becomes a huge problem, because then you have to rely on the expertise of the interviewer and so on and so forth. That's why you get that. It doesn't mean that we don't have skilled people, but we don't have skilled in the sense of having certificates from some institutions and so on. I think that's about it. Thank you.
So I'll respond to why I think PLFS is not a good idea. Essentially, compromises are not good solutions, and that's where I come from. So the earlier quinquennial surveys were very detailed, and there was a lot of good that could come from an analysis of that detailed information. If the PLFS implies that those detailed questions will never be asked, it's a huge loss. And I think that's not an acceptable loss. So sure, those questionnaires should undergo change over time, but that detailed way of finding out what's going on, I think should not have been lost. The PLFS tries to do a quarterly urban survey and an annual rural survey. It tries to do a compromise. So if you require a fast frequency survey, then do a fast frequency survey. And then do once in 5 years a detailed survey, which tells us about the structural changes happening in the economy in a deeper sense. So that's my disagreement. PLFS falls between two good stools. In my opinion, you require a detailed survey and a fast frequency survey.
I just said, ideally, that's exactly what we would have wanted also, but these decisions were already made. Because originally the idea should have been that have the PLFS, but also keep the quinquennial. But this is this decision is not. Yeah, so then the attempt was how to save as much information as possible in the PLFS, and I think if you look at it carefully, you will see that a lot of it is retained. There are many things which are not, but that particularly applies to people outside the labor force. There the information base will be very, very poor. But about those who are in labor force, I think information base remains quite good.
So the second question I think Professor Ghosh raised is the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey is a panel, and a panel cannot reflect change sufficiently. I understood the question correctly.
Yes.
In certain respects. All I will say, I think that's a valid point. So being aware of that, number one, we do keep on increasing the sample, and we do lose people from the panel because of a whole lot of things. I mean, there are very interesting reasons why people drop off the panel, and we keep on adding. Our objective is to increase the panel by 1.5 to 2% number of households, not individuals, per annum. And this is always done not as a replacement, but by finding new villages and new enumeration blocks in towns. We don't increase towns, but we increase the number of blocks within a town. Now, although this is a panel, I may say that we see a lot of variation. So we have seen a trend-like change. So it's not like a random, very bouncy change month to month or even week to week. So the long time series, and long time series is only 3 years, has seen the impact of demonetization, the combined impact of demonetization and GST, and I think the changes are seen even within the panel. Maybe there is a good reason for us to also have a purely cross-sectional database once in 5 years, but this panel is showing us some change, and I think we should do some research on this. The CDS that we talk about, the current daily status, is certainly not comparable to the CDS that we talk of in NSSO terms. NSSO terms, the reference point is still a week. In our case, this is what is your status today. So using the term current daily status in both the places is not comparable. I should find another term to describe my status. But this is an unambiguous status as of a date and time. That's all. But I will say, Professor Ghosh, you have said that you don't disagree with the high frequency data. You only think it should be used carefully. So don't you think we should do a lot more research using this fast frequency data? And there is a lack of research and interest in research in this data?
So I'll start with what you said, Radhika, in terms of the ideal dream statistical architecture. So of course we did have thick round and thin rounds. Also, I don't know what happened to the thin rounds in the whole controversy over the thick rounds. That was the NSS, and that was exactly the embodiment of this principle. That every 5 years we'll do a large sample and then we'll do a thin sample. Anyway, but I would say such a compromise I think is really the only way to go. You do something every 5 years which is detailed. You do something that as you can handle. Trade-offs are massive. The only thing I would add to that is a time use survey every 5 or 10 years. I'm not even very ambitious, setting my bar very, very low. The establishment enterprises where really I think is a problem. And I've used a lot of enterprise data, but I've also used it very skeptically. Knowing what I do from ethnography and from my own field experience, I know how ridiculously easy it is to get garbage information if you talk to firm owners, especially about things like, turnover and number of workers. If you're not careful, you're just going to get something. And I don't know how to solve that. I think this problem is much more severe for enterprises than for households, my personal. Just very quickly on what Professor Ghosh said, I'm very disappointed about this PLFS news, and I'll tell you why. Because I was very excited to see the schedule. When they put out the instruction manual for staff with the sampling strategy and everything, at the end of it they have the schedule, and it has a very beautiful weekly module on it, with not only which goes beyond the NSS module. It has number of hours spent in activities. It doesn't. Earlier it was a 0.51 system for those who are familiar. Whether you didn't work in that activity, you worked half a day or worked a full day. This one actually asked the number of hours, and we were jumping off our seats thinking, oh wow, this is what we're going to get, and now you're telling us that they have gotten rid of it. They're there, no? No, every day of the reference week, the number of hours spent in a particular activity. It's on. Go for it.
Okay. No, in fact, that data has been collected. It's there. That's why I said it's possible to estimate underemployment also.
Okay.
You know, that was substituted for the because we could not have current daily status also. So it's actually more detailed in the sense that a number of hours and number of hours you would have liked to work and you didn't find work, etc. So, but you know, the data have not come out. That's the problem. We haven't seen it. I mean, you need to get to unit level data to get that, but they are there. Well, I take this opportunity perhaps to respond to Mahesh also, briefly. Okay, high frequency data. You see, and my point of view, I said, I think clearly that I think they're useful. It's not that I think that they should not be there. But we should be careful in using it in the sense, for example, I mean, here again, Mahesh, I disagree with Mahesh because I do not think Reserve Bank of India can sit down and say, okay, you know, in the last quarter, the unemployment rate has risen by 0.5 percentage point or 1 percentage point, and therefore, you know, we need to do something with the interest rate. I mean, it's not just, it's not this kind of economy, and it's not, in fact, Reserve Bank of India, I don't even think can do inflation targeting. But so forget about you know, with an open economy, open capital flows, and so on. You just don't have that control over inflation. It seems to me. But anyhow, I mean, it is this that I was trying to point to. It's good. We can get, you know, from high frequency data we do get a good picture of what's happening. Not a full picture, but good picture of what's going on. But I don't think it can be used in that kind of way. That was really my point.
Can I just say one thing about the skill point? I absolutely agree with you, Professor Ghosh, about the skill being defined the way it is. But what I have found is that in the policy literature, this has been used without that key proviso that you added on at the end. Right? So we forget that this is skills as defined by formal training, and it just becomes at some point skills.
Some of the last point you made was that lack of respect, I take from what you're saying, is a factor that determines a person taking up a job or not taking up a job. Can you elaborate this one a bit? Because the reasons for unemployment gives me one more reason. I haven't heard this from inside. But if you can elaborate on this is an interesting take on unemployment. And I have read in many places that there is a cultural problem. Indians prefer to work in places where brains are used more than hands are used. So if you could elaborate this, I think it would be good for all of us.
It's a much longer conversation, obviously, but very, very quickly what I was alluding to was, and I said this is speculation because this is not based on my work, but because India happens to be a country where the head-hand dichotomy is there all over in the world. So we are not specialists in respecting people who work with the hand less. But we've also added to that an achievement of coding it into caste. And that significantly, I think, alters things because there is a massive push away from those kinds of jobs which are seen to be lower caste jobs by lower caste people who have acquired education. This is the key, right? So when you're talking about reason for not taking up a job, Your aspirations are being driven by a value system that is very, very strong. It's giving you all the signals that if you're coming from a farm household or a weaver household, you are a son of a weaver and you have a BA in history. You're a trained weaver, and this is not anymore a hypothetical situation. You're a trained weaver and with a BA in history. You know that you can earn a living with weaving. And in fact, you're trained there. BA in history has not trained you for much of anything, honestly, if you knew the kind of college that you went to. But what kind of job do you want? You want a job that draws on the BA in history. Because we have completely failed to make these occupations either remunerative or dignified. And I'm talking about both, insist on both because they're actually a little bit independent, even though obviously they're connected closely to each other.
Just have about 15 minutes left, so I think we can open the floor to questions. I think we'll take a set of 3 questions at a time, and then the panelists can respond. Sure, Smita.
This is a question for Mr. Vyas. From a sort of a Schumpeterian standpoint, one is very curious about the relationship between your employed category of answers and the first category of unemployed. Because the assumption is that if you have a set of skills, which you may not be able to describe perhaps in the survey, but you anticipate that you might be able to take some kind of risk in switching over to a situation where you might be own account or self-employed, entrepreneurial in some degree, that transition is very, very important from the standpoint of the economy. But it's one in which we don't see a lot of research. So connecting this discussion back to what we were discussing yesterday, one of the evolutionary pieces to really draw on is the relationship between that first employed as of yesterday and the question of how do you think about the unemployment category 1. So I wanted to ask you, is there a thinking in CMIE perhaps to start looking at drawing out some of the insights of that one transition, and then secondly to connect it to the answers on the time to start working, the anticipated time to start working that you're thinking of adding on?
This is with respect to Mahesh, your survey, of course, you in any case write regularly about the pattern of employment and labor force survey. And one of the ways, of course, which scholars would be very happy to use, even that limited question that you initially put in, of course you're now expanding the list, is if they could correlate with other features. Household feature, worker features, things which you already have in the survey. So for example, a lot of the demonetization and the impact stuff that you put out, if we could correlate it with household characteristics and who appears to have been affected and where and so on, and that would make for a beautiful extended study of the kind of data that we don't have.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for a wonderful panel. My question is actually, first is a comment to Radhika, where you said that the informal sector is defined as residual. That's no longer true. The ILO has done a tremendous job of defining 2 different definitions, one of the informal sector in 1993 and then of informal employment in 2003. And the 1993 definition, after that, the ILO has been systematically trying to help countries to integrate those questions into the surveys. And in 99-2000 NSSO quinquennial round, we have integrated many of these questions so that you can actually calculate an informal sector and informal employment. And we've used it extensively in our NCUS report. NCUS report used it very extensively. Yeah, so I think it's time that we're very clear that there are definitions of the informal sector and of informal employment, and they are being used. My question is to Mahesh, that when you're doing this daily thing, is it really 1,500 households in the country? And when you're doing the monthly one, is it 43,000 households? If that's the case, then yeah, I'd just like to point this out. Is this true?
So I'll let the panelists respond, and then
So both the questions from Smita and Ravi are research questions. Both of them are answerable with the raw data. So over to you. So I'll tell you. When I said this, not tongue in cheek, but I look upon my job at CMI as a measurements company. I do not do academic research. I do not write papers. I help and assist researchers to write their papers. So if I get to know your questions, I will try to see how I can help you map the data we have with other data and possibly add data and help you do data. And therefore I said over to you. But I think your question, Smita, was really excellent. It is bang on, it is doable with the new questions we have asked. And I think it should be done. So that's a good one. And Ravi, of course, yours is a more generalized question on the same lines, that there is a lot of information that we are capturing in the survey which can be correlated. And others have told me this as well very often. But I am focusing on measurement, and no matter how much I am drawn into this, you can do this, I say no, let others do it. So I'm just demarcating my role and not getting strayed.
I'm only saying it can be done.
Sure, it can be done. And it is true, 1,500 households every day, 43,000 households every month. 1,500 is an approximation, but we are broadly there. What happens is that we have of the order of, I think, some 1,300 and something. It's a rounded number, or maybe 1,400 and something, is the number of households we are supposed to do in a day. And that number is frozen. 4 months in advance, we know exactly which are those 1,400 households. So there is no play over there. The only problem is the actual execution may not allow us to do one particular household on the day we are supposed to do it. There could be any failure. The household was not there, we couldn't reach there was a flood, there was a problem. It could be anything. So we allow a household scheduled to be done today to be done at most 2 days later. So our 10,000 households a week is more solid. Our 1,500 households a day is less solid. It can go up one day, it can go a little down one day. But a week, 10,500 households is pretty solid. And 43 households a month is very solid. And the monthly estimates we do are adjusted for non-response. Because we know exactly what is that count, and we can do a non-response calculation. We cannot do this for weekly and daily because of logistics problems and problems associated with adjusting the non-response in that. That's the answer to your question.
Next, Rahul.
She had a question. My question is to Mahesh Vyas, and the second question is for all of you panel. Most of the jobs are generated into non-farm sectors, and we're actually going through the data which you are collecting. Tenure security is most important quality of any particular job which is created. And in the last NSSO round, they have significantly shown that the people do not have a written contract. So when you collect the data about the people who are working, the casual worker, the regular worker, do you also collect the data on the contract, what type of contract they hold? And also because it is correlate with the other social security features, the quality of data is there. Okay, that's the first question. Second is about how do you take into account the migration factors also, because migration is also one, because you collect the data. So whether that factors also into your unemployment statistics and the employment statistics. Third question is common to all panel. Like recently, I've been using with the NFHS data to understand why the female labor force has been actually decreasing. It has a potential to give a lot of robust shortages because their database is so exhaustive. But the problem with when I was talking to the IIPS, some of the demographers, they have they said that there is no one who can actually skilled with the employment related statistics. So is this possible to have, because all people who are working in the different capacity, can we really collaborate with them and actually can make, because they collect data, the women workforce as well as the household level data. So that's the one thing. And sorry, just I forgot, like I remember the last question. Since it is a high frequency data we are talking about, we recently collected the data of 100 people, Swiggy workers, okay, who are actually working that. And what we noticed that the intensity of employment is very high during their weekend. So they are unemployed between Monday to Thursday, and they are highly employed during this thing. So can these also, this daily status could be factored in, because you collect the data on daily basis. So we can see the mobility and the working intensity during the week also. We collected 150 like a sample. I think this would give you the different picture largely. Thank you.
Hello. Two short questions. First question is, we have high numbers of casual and self-employed workers, right? So that means wages are not decided by the supply and demand side. So that means the uncertain constant wage setting and price setting, what kind of information the high frequency data give related to the rigidity of labor market, like whether they are rigid or flexible. And second question is just weird and fear. Can high frequency data give more power to MNC or firm to discriminate wages, because now they have excessive power related to excessive power over the information related to supply side of labor.
So this is a question. I'm Rajat Kathuria from Ukraine. I had a question for Professor Ghosh on this debate between high frequency versus more robust long-term data. Sort of a general question. In your vast experience, what has been the use of, let's say, this low frequency, high intensity data to make labor market interventions as opposed to growth interventions? Has, in your experience, has any of the outcome from the NSSOs been targeted at labor market interventions? I mean, we've done a lot of pro-growth interventions, which we now know don't lead to employment creation. So, I mean, these labor-intensive textiles, which Arvind spoke about in his economic survey, or coastal economic zones that Arvind Panagaria spoke about, I mean, these have not really materialized. So, in your experience, have there been any targeted labor, employment creation policies based on the NSSO data?
Much that question on giving employers power was very interesting one, I have to say. It's also very interesting because there's a more general conversation I was having just a few days ago about how more information is not always a very good thing. And when you're talking about employment statistics and all this controversy, this point sometimes gets missed, right? So there's a lot of ethnographic work that people do on the strategies of the poor, survival strategies and so forth. And occasionally you have to step outside and remind yourself that, maybe I shouldn't be telling the world all the stuff that I'm finding out, because I don't particularly see that it's helping anybody. And that's for the students also in the room, I think, very important thing to keep in mind, that more data does not equal better whatever it is. You have outcomes. You have to think about who that data is being generated by, for what purpose, who has access to it, all the power issues. Mahesh was telling me earlier that there may be some other surveys they may be trying in the future where certain untargeted parts of the population might be targeted. So that would be interesting, because generally it's the poor who are available to give information. And so we end up having a lot of information about the poor and not so much about the rich. So should we have employer data that is better available to the poor? Absolutely. So that improves their bargaining power. But that said, the brief answer to your question, I think, is that any employer is going to have very good, their own micro understanding about the labor market that matters to them. I think it might be unlikely that they would get much more additional insight from a survey like this at the level of their micro bargaining, but I may be wrong.
So your first question was on contract. Do we get information on the contract itself or not? The answer is no. We only ask whether you're employed or not and the status of your employment nowadays, but we don't actually see what the terms of the contract are or whether there's a signed contract at all or not. So we don't have that answer. Your question on migration is very important. And I forgot to mention this in my slideshow, is that in recent times we have seen migrants within India being ill-treated, be it in Gujarat or in Bombay and many other places. They have been ill-treated, and if there is a law and order problem in a region, the first people targeted are the migrants, very often. So we wanted to see if our data gives us some insights into this, and I was appalled that our panel does not have good coverage of migrants, because they live oftentimes in chammaris. So it's possible for us to get the migrants in Bangalore, they're in middle-class societies, but the guys who live in chammaris, those people who huddle together in a small shack of kind somewhere, all people who live in the restaurants behind. You know, there's a restaurant in the front, but those workers are all staying behind that, and many other similar places, we are unable to capture the migrants. So we started to ask households of our panel, has anyone from your household migrated out? And if so, where? So we're trying to get the answer in the reverse order, then see what we can do with it. So this is the tricky problem, and I don't think any household survey can easily capture this, because those guys are fluid. They're here one day, they're gone another day, they're gone again another day, so on and so forth. So migrants is a problem worth dealing with. The tricky question is very interesting. So I will look at a very different kind of Monday effect. So we'll study this data and see what it means. I think I could lip read you, Rajat, that you were saying Friday effect. Right.
Well, about the question on labor market intervention versus growth intervention. Now, of course, you know, I hold the view, as I said, that what we need is, in fact, growth interventions. Labor market interventions are not as yet in our kind of economy. But having said that, you know, labor market interventions can be of two kinds. One kind is we already do, like Narega, for example, is the sort of labor market intervention that can be done in the short run, whose function is to set, in a way, to set some kind of a floor also to the casual wage and so on, and of course, so it's on the demand side intervention. The other kind of labor market interventions, of course, are concerned with labor market reforms ideas, which are again not quite short run, but if we think of those kinds of interventions, then certainly from the NSSO as well as ASI and so on database, we can say something about that kind of intervention. For example, there's been quite a bit of research on you know, the labor market rigidity issue and how to make it flexible and so on. This type of labor market intervention certainly can be done from the database that we have, and I see that that's the only, you know, I don't see the other labor market intervention I see necessarily in the form of special employment schemes. I don't think there is any other kind of intervention that's relevant or will work here. So that's not something that's missing. And growth interventions is the most important part. And again, it's not short run, but we need the good understanding, because employment, essentially, what does it mean? It means that people should be going from low productivity to higher productivity jobs. That's what we mean by employment growth in this, and also from underemployment to full-time employment. Now, as far as these things are concerned, NSS data are very good in giving us the view and giving us what was happening, and in giving us. Problem was frequency. That is you know, well known, admitted, but this is also a bigger question of, you know, resources and of that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to get back to the issue that Jimodi raised about informality. Again, the point I was really trying to make was that, so we have all these definitions of informality, but as we move ahead, we have these old forms of informal work arrangements, but there are new forms of informal work arrangements which are also going to emerge. So we do probably need to revisit also how we define the concept, because if informality and informal work arrangements will increasingly be the norm, then we need to also think about how we're going to reduce the decent work deficit in the informal sector. So given the rapidly changing and new emerging forms of informal employment, we need to revisit those definitions, but we will of course hear more from you on that on the session on informality. Thank you all very much. It's been an extremely enriching session. Of course, this is something, this is not the last we are going to hear about employment data. We could well have another session in a few months when the PLFS data is made available and we have the unit data, and then we can actually have another round of conversations about the issues of comparability and what actually has happened to labor markets in India over the last few years. So thank you all. Thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you all for your very interesting engaging questions. Thank you.
Thank you, respected panelists, for such an informative session. I now request Dr. Radhika Kapoor to felicitate Dr. Ajit Ghosh. Mr. Mahesh Vyas. And Dr. Amit Basoli. Thank you, ma'am. I now request our director, Dr. Jyoti Chandiramani, to felicitate Dr. Radhika Kapoor. Thank you, ma'am. May I request all the track panelists, Director Madam and Deputy Director Sir, to gather for a group photograph.
Can you allow me to take one, please? Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.